This is ritual 4, and part of our technique is to keep track of where we are. It's like a compass or a sextant, the old navigation tools. And this education has its way of navigating through the entire field of human being. On one level, we have a horizontal quality, which is the basis of nature. And that horizontal has a 4-part structure. It has nature, and then moving clockwise, ritual, and then myth, and then symbol. So that if you leaned on the horizontal table of the natural ecology, the natural cycle, you would put nature in the east, and you would have ritual in the south, myth in the west, and symbols in the north. So that if you wanted to find your way magnetically, you would consult the symbols and where the symbols are positioned. But if you wanted to deal electrically, you would start with nature in the west. So that in the horizontal way, this education in its structure offers to you a chance to orient yourself in a truthful way and to take that orientation into any kind of human wisdom tradition and be able to understand its esoteric structure, regardless of whether those teaching you know it or not, or whether you yourself knew it or not, and to awaken in ourselves an affinity with the deep truths of orientation which are already in us. Along with that horizontal quaternary, there is then a pair to that, which would be the vertical. And the vertical would have at its zenith, at its position, the complement to symbols, which would be cosmos. And the way to orient that vertical is to place the initial vision where one would find the east, so that nature in the horizontal would also be the place on the vertical where vision would go. And then vision would be due east horizontally. Then moving down, one would come to art. And then moving back up to cut the horizontal again, one would come to history, and then the zenith would be science. So that one runs vision, art, history, science. Now notice that there are correlations that happen here. Not only does vision correlate with nature, but history correlates with myth. So that nature and vision and myth and history share standpoints, but from a different perspective. The perspective of nature is of a horizontal quality, whereas the perspective of vision is of a vertical quality. So that vision overlaps nature, but comes at a different angle. So that there is an opportunity in wholeness to look with the kind of eyes that would look at an optical illusion, a paradoxical sight, where one can see nature as nature, but one could also learn to see nature as vision. In just the same way, but on a very much more deeply learned quality I don't mean learned in an academic sense, but learned in a wisdom sense. One can look at myth from a historical perspective. And when one looks at myth from a historical perspective, that particular outlook as a discipline in education would be called history of ideas. And under history of ideas, something like Jungian archetypal psychology would be that kind of quality. Looking at myth with historical consciousness. Now, in this correlation of the horizontal circle of 4 parts and the vertical circle of 4 parts, symbols would give you true north, and science would give you true zenith. And in this sense, one can use this education, use the structure of the education as a tool for locating oneself, regardless of whatever time you lived, regardless of whatever culture you came out of, regardless of the social or sociological ambience of that age, of that time, of that moment, regardless of your education, whether you're educated greatly, a little bit, or none at all, so that the particular structure of this education is truly like, I liken it unto the discovery of the structure of DNA. Once you know the structure of DNA, the structure of DNA was fortified by the early 50s, and now, less than half a century later, one is able to come within a few years of characterizing the entire human genome. The whole genetic mapping of all life within about a 50-year period. So that this education, somewhere in the middle of the 21st century, will be able to characterize not only the past and the present, but any future that is available for conscious beings like ourselves, which will give the navigational techniques into the hands of the living to be able to not only master any past or live in any present or modify any present, one will be able to foresee any possible future that you would like to pursue and be able to then find both the cardinal actualities that need to be attained and also the ordinal sequencing of those. The Apollo moon program was distinguished by a shift of consciousness of unbelievable proportions. In order to get a man to the moon, problems that had never before been seen had not only to be seen, but to be solved, and to be solved in ways that had never before been seen also. So that the Apollo moon program was the first kindergarten exercise in the new millennium, the 3rd millennium, if you like. Not just the 21st century, but a whole new millennium. For the 21st century is one way of looking at it. 3rd millennium is another. By the way, I count it's already 100th millennium or something like that. We've done this in the wisdom tradition long, long time. Looking forward not only to the next century, but the next millennium and the next year, all at the same time. This kind of quality, and we talked last week about how some cycles are not only millennium, but bi-millennia, a new aeon. So it's a new year, it's a new century, it's a new millennium, it's a new aeon. But it also happens to be, sort of like in a 5th order, the beginning of a whole new 26,000-year cycle, the progression of the equinoxes cycle, a very great year. And so this new quality of coming in, it's not just a new mentality, it's also a new feeling tone, intelligence. It's also a new way in which existence gestalts itself. It's a new way in which symbols waken the mind, the way in which the mind itself is constituted. All of these changes are happening now. We don't have to wait for the year 2000. The millennium began already in its nascent beginnings about 200 years ago. One can look at this, and actually one of the great pioneers of the new way of thought was Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, Leibniz, Newton, three individuals who characterized the first pioneering of new ways of thought. Not only new ways of thought, but new ways of feeling, new ways of gestalting existence, new ways of the way in which this whole horizontal quaternary and the vertical quaternary work together, and the way in which their relationality matrix constitutes literally a new presentation of reality. So by 1996, we're already a couple of centuries on the way there. The actual watershed was 1993, about 3 years ago. So in a way, you could say that we're living in 3 AD now. We have the same kind of nascent quality that 3 AD would have. And why would 3 AD be so momentous? 3 AD was about the time when Jesus was of age to have his grand bar mitzvah. And his bar mitzvah was to leave the environs of Palestine and go back to Egypt, to go back to Alexandria, and begin his in-depth education. So that we live in a momentous kind of a time where the correlations are enormous. This kind of education is made to work in a refreshed, enlarged, deepened way as the education that would have been given to Jesus in Alexandria around 3 AD. If you get interested in this, my book, Jesus in Alexandria, when it comes out, covers the entire development on this. What I'm saying here this morning is that this education is not simply coming every Saturday and enjoying or not enjoying or somewhat enjoying lectures, but it is a development on many dimensions and many scales. And to miss that is to miss exactly what is happening here. It's in sports called not being in the game. And you cannot play well if you're not in the game. So in a way, it's like a star pitcher who's on the mound is pitching no-hitter. It's worth following because there is an excitement, there's an elan, there's a charisma. But the charisma is not there on the surface, but there in the coordinated actuality of the way in which the sequence unfolds in its ordinality and the remarkable objects that are there in their cardinality. Let's come back and let's do a favorite technique of starting again. This kind of motion of coming back and beginning again in mathematics is called recursion, recursive functions. And a recursive function always has an ability to refer back to its own beginning and to augment the development by the increment of the set that one has skipped back over. Now, this happens to be a very great development in the new millennium, in the new aeon, in the new consciousness, because the ability to have a recursive function whose increment is exactly the set of the sequence that one is recursing, if I can use that term, I'm making it up, that principle is the principle of developing an algorithm. And an algorithmic structure is able to learn from its mistakes, to learn while it's doing. This is something which ritual cannot do. It's something which tradition cannot convey. And what we're looking at now in our education is the way in which ritual teaches tradition. But the technique that I'm using at this particular moment is very advanced. It's an algorithmic structure which allows you to have a learning consciousness at the same time. So we're looking at ritual as an object of investigation, but the way in which we're looking at ritual now is many dimensions beyond ritual itself. We began by talking about how there is a horizon of outlook, which one could liken to tabletop. The popular phrase, we want to understand what we're doing, let's put our cards on the table. The cards on the table are that there is a cycle of integration, a cycle of development that happens. And it happens naturally. And its beginning is always in nature. Why is it always in nature? Because if we began any other place other than in nature, the development leads inevitably into skepticism and devolves into a nihilism. Skepticism is the ability to doubt, which is one step ahead of the ability to believe. And a skeptical development inevitably leads to the disbelief prematurely of a belief before it is solidified, and this is nihilism. This kind of equality cannot happen in nature because nature does not offer any kind of rock bottom basis where the skepticism can take hold. Nature is a matrix of change. It's always shifting. It's always flowing. And we've seen, looking at nature, when we began with Thoreau and the I Ching. And we saw how the I Ching characterized the reality of what is happening, not by things, but by change. That things are not exactly always permanently what they are, but they're always changing, so that it is change itself that is more stable than the items of change. Not things, but their phases. And we saw with Thoreau at the same time as the I Ching, bringing a kind of a focus into our sight, that Thoreau's outlook was that of an individual who was able to absorb himself so much into nature that he became a part of the flow itself, and then was able to take that flow, the image of Thoreau as being the surveyor of a snowstorm, standing outside of Concord in a snowstorm with the trees, saying that the experience of the snowstorm had not been looked at from the standpoint of the trees by human beings for an extremely long period of time. And being so much a part of the forest in that snowfall that he began to feel that his consciousness was the consciousness of the land. And out of this came a development that was characteristic of the United States at the time, a characteristic which was called transcendentalism. And the transcendentalists understood that our absorption into nature allows us to be completely natural, but that there's a reciprocity that happens. Not only do we get the naturalness of nature, but that nature gets from us the consciousness of our individuality. And so nature becomes individually conscious while we become naturally natural. And this reciprocity, as we have seen now in ritual, is the characteristic way in which ritual comportment always happens. We don't just do something, but there's always an exchange. As we do something, what we are doing recursively happens to us also. There's always an exchange. And we've talked about for the last 3 weeks how this exchange is a kind of an osmosis. So that nature, rather than having walls, has membranes. Instead of walls which define and make things, there are membranes that make focuses of activity, and those focuses are constantly in communication with each other, constantly in relationality with each other. And so that nature is a seething ongoingness rather than a static categorical thusness. This quality of membrane, permitting the osmosis, appears in ritual as the drum. The covering surface of the drum, the membrane of the drum, allows for the sound, the vibration, the deep resonance of the drum, both to be within it and to be without the same sound. So that the shaman's drum is one of the indexing factors of the reciprocity in ritual. And the pace, the sequence of the way in which actions happen is always indexed by the song, so that in a way the chant or the songs are an ordinal index to ritual, whereas the drum beat itself is a cardinal ordering of ritual. And in this way, primordial men and women learned to understand, before there was anything like a development of logic or mathematics, they learned to understand that if you sing, if you weave your song in with the beat of the drum, you come up with a braided quality of energy which universally has been called power. Power and powers. The power comes from the drum beat. The power comes from the actuality of things. And the actuality of things is punctuated and underscored by the beat of the drum. And woven into the actuality of things is an ordering sequence. The sequence of things is their alignment. And so in ritual always, one vivifies each thing, brings each thing into awakenedness. And then as each thing is awakened, it is woven into the ongoing ordinal pattern of its alignment. So that ritual is highly intelligent. It has a really fine point to it. And when we say later on that our developments are going to go many dimensions beyond ritual, this is not to denigrate ritual at all, but to build upon it. Let's take an example to try and bring all of this together. Notice a recursion, another recursive function. Let's go back to the beginning again. Let's go back for the third time this morning, back to the beginning. Let's ask something very fundamental. What are we talking about? Whatever are we talking about? We're talking about what is. We began talking about what is in such a way that it was very difficult initially to come off the streets of LA and jump into it. So then we took a recursive tact and we talked about it a second time in a way which gave us an example looking at what is and trying to talk about almost like a craftsman who would look at some kind of archetypal design and make, say, a table out of it. Now we're talking about it in a third way. We're going to come back the way in which a painter would look at this. A painter would look not at the ideal form and make a table, but the painter would make a representational image of the table, of the particular table, say on a canvas or in a mosaic or on a ceramic, something like that. So that coming back for a third time to begin, we now have a way in which to understand a major development in our past, a major problem in our present, and a major potential in our future, all at the same time. We have three different ways, three different beginnings with which to look at what we're doing, what we're talking about today. We have a very primordial way, which is almost like a mystical directness to go exactly to the way it is. We have a second way, our first recursion, of looking at the results of what is, the actuality in its individual existence. And now the second recursion will give us a third way of looking at a representational image of that existence, and by that second remove, give us an easier step to get at what is and its mystical primacy. These three steps, these three orders, the archetypal image, the existential fact, and the representation of that fact by an image in the mind, these three orders constitute the basis of mentality in the Western tradition. The whole structure of mind in the Western tradition is founded upon this particular basis. The origins of it in terms of written documentation comes from Plato, from his dialogue called The Republic. And if you need a good translation of The Republic, this one done a couple of years ago by Robin Waterhouse, Plato's Republic, published by Oxford University Press. I think it's in paperback now. Robin Waterfield, a young, excellent, spry translator. In the structure of Plato's Republic, there are 10 books. Plato's Republic is the longest of all his dialogues. In translation and notes here, it's almost 500 pages. Plato is talking about, in the Republic, what possible structure could human civilization have that would make it worth doing, make it worth as an improvement upon the tribal level by which the Greeks had always lived. For the Greeks, like almost all human populations, the only population I don't include, which is why I say almost all, is there might have been walk-ins in antiquity. Before Sedona, I'm sure there were other portals for the walk-ins to come in and inhabit who knows what, for what purposes. But all other human populations looked at this kind of development from a tribal aspect initially. Human beings, like ourselves, whether in China or in Turkey or in Argentina or in Canada, wherever, human populations survived because they were able to aggregate themselves into effective groups. Individuals, by themselves, do not outlast their own lifetime. The tradition of an individual passed on to another individual is one of the most precarious threads there is. And we'll talk about later on the way in which that particular thread was developed in Asia in a distinct tradition which was called the Patriarchs of Zen Buddhism. And the Patriarchs of Zen Buddhism was a creative development in advanced consciousness quite a long time ago now, about 1800 years ago. But other than that, all human beings have survived because they are members of a group or of a tribe. And so tribal ritual was the foundation of the way in which all human life was lived and is lived even up till today. All of these things which we see, all of the functions that we participate with, the mind that we think with, the feelings that we have in our experience, the language, the forms and content of language, the grammar, the syntax, the vocabulary, all of this is a world which is based upon tribal ritual tradition, which is why we're looking at it now. And tribal ritual condition is always nested in nature. That's why we began with nature. We began with the I Ching and Thoreau to get the flavor of being absorbed in a process of change, and how being absorbed in that process of change adds something to us at the same time as adding something to nature. And so men and women, when they practiced their ritual comportment, understood that while they were giving something to nature, nature was reciprocating and giving something to them. And this reciprocity, as a way in which ritual happens, always took the form, both in its ordinal sequencing and in its cardinal numbering, always took the form of a tribal group. We would say in logic, we would call this sets. Or in more advanced logic, one would call this types. And we'll talk about, if we can get to it, the way in which the discovery about 100 years ago that there is no single, final, cardinal number was an insight for a man named Georg Cantor, that there was such a thing as transfinite numbers, and the development of transfinite numbers led to all kinds of developments in theory of numbers, and these led to a development around the turn of the 20th century by the man responsible for putting all of the pieces together was Bertrand Russell. And Bertrand Russell came up with his theory of types. And once he had his theory of types, it appeared in a book called The Principles of Mathematics. And it was like being stung by a bug that would not go away. And Russell rubbing the itch in his mind of the realization that there was a fundamental, real contradiction in the way in which logic must work. That logic, in order to work, has to imbibe in itself a paradoxical contradiction at its most fundamental development and level. It so bothered Russell, who was a very proper Victorian Britisher. That is to say, he sinned on the side all the time, but it was always on the side. And it was always proper in the front. That's why he lived 97 years. Secret sins are a source of vitality for Victorian types. Russell kept rubbing this mental itch that came out in the 1901 publication, The Principles of Mathematics, and he and Alfred North Whitehead labored for about 10 years and produced a 3-volume set called Principia Mathematica. Not just the principles of mathematics, but Principia Mathematica, which was a complete redoing of Sir Isaac Newton's Principia, upon which all development in engineering and physics and astronomy and cosmology, all higher scientific thought was founded on Newton's Principia until Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica completely shook the foundations of thought. And the seed that grew into the plant that shook the foundations of thought was the contradiction, the idea that there was a fundamental paradox in logical thought that appeared in the book, The Principles of Mathematics. And what Russell found, based upon Dedekind and Cantor and a couple of other thinkers, Frege and a few others, he found that the traditional ritual of grouping, that tribal structure of aggregating reality and mistaking it for individuality, was a source of fundamental flaw in the human mind. Not so much in the human mind qua mind, but in the way in which the human mind was structured in Western thought. That Western civilization was like a bell that had a crack in it. And every time you rang that bell, the crack was there in the sound, whether you could hear it or not. And that when you had to grind really fine to find truth exactly where it was, the crack was there obscuring what you could find. And every time you wanted to get into the larger picture and find what was the all, the crack was there. And so on the very large and very small, the Western mind was fundamentally flawed. Not because of any content of a belief, but because of the structure of the mind, that regardless of whatever belief you had. The flaw appears first in print in Plato and is passed on primarily to his great student Aristotle, who codified it so that the flaw came nicely dressed. It had a new suit and had shiny shoes with Aristotle. And with the oohs and ahs of the medieval period, which we've mentioned occasionally, where the medieval scholastics tried to take back their Greek Aristotle from the Arabs who had appropriated it, it was cemented into the religious outlook of the Western world by Thomas Aquinas and several other thinkers of the time. And the flaw became so omnipresent as to be expected to be real. All this has to do with the way in which ritual today, if practiced by us, leads inevitably to a flawed existence. Let's take a break. The whole first half of the lecture for Ritual 4 this morning was about a fundamental flaw that appears. And it appears east and west. But the flaw was caught both east and west. The difference being is that the techniques to catch the flaw in the east were always dominant in the civilization, whereas the ways in which to catch the flaw in the west became esoteric and hidden from the general population. And because in the west there was an esoteric reality deeper than the ordinary civilization. The Western psyche developed an unconscious. Whereas in Asia, or in the American Indians, there is no unconscious. One of the most startling letters of Carl Jung, written in 1942, it's in the volume of letters published by Princeton University Press, to another psychiatrist, a man named Milt. His last name was Milt, B, initial B, Milt, in the summer of 1942. And Milt apparently had written to Jung, commenting on his preface that he wrote to The Secret of the Golden Flower, a Taoist meditation classic. And Jung, in writing back to him, said it's notorious in psychotherapy that the Chinese are not amenable to Western psychotherapy because they have no unconscious. We talked about how the source of the Western unconscious is at once a flaw, and also, because the flaw occurs on the ritual level, it always shows up every time a ritual comportment is practiced. And in a way, it's like having a computer that has a glitch on the keyboard. And every time you use the keyboard, the glitch shows. If you examine the computer in and of itself, you will not find the flaw. Western thought has developed enormously by trying to find out what's wrong. And the development in the Western tradition is that there's nothing wrong, really. And yet, every time we use that which is not wrong, it turns out not right. Now, this is called by many names. It's called absurdity by Albert Camus. It's called stupido by the Three Stooges. But it's a quality that's there in the ambience, not only in people and in the psyches, but in every artifact made so that the entire world of things literally has the inability to have resonance. And so we live in a world of dead things that cannot be awakened into sacredness. Now, this is an old problem. About 1800 years ago in Rome, one of the great teachers of the day, a man named Plotinus, had a visitor from Egypt. He was an arcane wisdom divination master from Egypt that came to visit Plotinus because Plotinus was born in Egypt, grew up there. And the man got interested in conjuring up the guardian spirit of Plotinus so that Plotinus' students could see the guardian spirit of Plotinus. And in order to do this conjuring up of the guardian spirit, they had to be on sacred land. And they couldn't find any sacred land in the enormous city of Rome. Rome was about 2 million people at the time. It was a 20th century city 2,000 years ago. And they finally found one patch of land that had not been profaned, and that was the courtyard in the temple of the Vestal Virgins. And of course, Plotinus' guardian spirit, when he was conjured, was revealed to be God himself. The guardian spirit is always one level above our highest level. And as we improve, we incorporate those levels in ourselves, and the guardian spirit moves up until finally the guardian spirit is God himself. And we have but one more level to go to reach up, and this was in Hellenistic times called being saved. It's a long way from the book-thumping, tent-top kind of quality of being saved that we get today. In a world where everything is profane, no things can be awakened into life, and so they cannot be aligned. And instead of being aligned, they can only be arranged. And we now would call this, using a standard kind of a sociology of religion vocabulary, we would say that this is a world of secular things. We hate to think of it as profane. That's too rough. That's too tough. So instead of sacred and profane, we prefer to say, well, sacred and secular. And somehow the ego feels comfortable. Well, we live in a secular world. That means we can do anything we want to do. But that's only playing with dead things that don't do anything. There's no nutrition in it at all. And so ritual, which has no traction, because in order to have ritual comportment, you have to have alignment that leads living vectors throughout nature so that it really works. If you need to have rain for those seedlings to grow, you've got to have rain. You can't just hope by guess and by golly that what you're going to do is going to produce rain. You have to know the right ritual to make rain, because one needs that rain now. And men and women in ancient times knew how to make rain when they needed it. I remember reading one time the biography of Navajo medicine man named Hosteen Claw by a woman, Frances Newcomb, whose husband and she ran the trading post on the Navajo reservation. And she wrote of how one time she and Claw were driving by themselves out across the Monument Valley area, and a huge storm came up, and a tornado, a twister, developed. And oddly enough, settled right on the road, right on the highway, and came towards them. And she stopped the car, and she realized that this tornado was coming exactly down the road towards them. She said Claw got out of the car and walked toward it, and on the way went to the side of the road and picked some leaves from some of the shrubbery and masticated it. And when he got very near to the cyclone, he spit at it, and she said it split in two. And the top part whirled away, and the bottom part went off the side of the road and churned dust. And he came back, and he just sat down. And she said that while he was out there, there was something so completely vivified about Claw. And yet when he came back, by the time he'd come back and just sat in the car, he was again just an old Indian. The ability to vivify to the spiritual vitality is one of the basic motives of ritual. It's why everything is founded upon it. Existence itself is founded upon ritual comportment. Electrons would not be electrons without it. Protons would not be protons without it. And the proton is one of the most stable, existent things, quote things. We have to learn not to call them things. What will we call them? It's better to call them events rather than things. Objects are events, and that these events together constitute a whole universe known as existence. And that ritual always takes place upon the table of existence. So when one sees, for instance, a symbolic picture of a ritual master, you can find it in, say, like the tarot deck, the magician's card. There's the table, and there are the 4 symbols that occupy the table. And you'll be able to have many books and lectures on the tarot and all of its symbolism and all of this. But the operative ritual focus is the table and not the symbols. The table is the ordinal ordering which allows for the alignment of the symbols. And each symbol needed to be vivified in itself, but had to be vivified to be in tune with something which is the substrate that allows for the symbols to do their indexing and meaning. That substrate is the table, the existence of it. When one sees any kind of Renaissance painting of the Last Supper, it's always the powerful table. That's the horizon of what's happening there. Whereas medieval portrayals of the Last Supper usually are propaganda, and they don't feature the table so much, but they feature some kind of magus quality. Where it isn't the disembodied magus who is powerful, but it's the man who is able to command the table and order all of the sacred vivified symbols together. There's where the power is. And so ancient tribal wisdom is very wise, extremely wise, without philosophy, without even religion. Those kinds of issues, those kinds of stylizations never occur in primordiality. There's no religion, there's no philosophy, but there is sacredness, and the sacredness registers primarily on a ritual comportment. Let's look at something for a second. One of our pairs of books is the Sacred Pipe, the 7 rituals of the Calumet of the Sacred Pipe. Black Elk's great accounting of the Oglala Sioux version of the Algonquin tradition of the Sacred Pipe. Central to this vivifying process, is the vivifying of each man in the tribe. That there comes a time when one is going to have a grand ritual that brings all of the meaning together, every aspect. And usually on the Plains Indians, this was the Sundance. The Sundance of the summer solstice, the apex of the power of the day, the sun's contact with the earth. And in that particular dance, the Sundance, in Algonquin, the name for it is Okan. The Okan has the need to not only vivify all things, the water, the plants, the stones, but in particular the men, because the men of the tribe are more prone to skewing off and going astray. And in order to purify the men, in Nipi, the sweat lodge is made, and the Uwipi ceremony of the sweat is made, and Black Elk goes into the rite of purification. The purification is not so much as getting rid of little defects or of getting yourself in some kind of parlor primitive yoga ready for a ceremony. It's deeper than that. It's vivifying to the sacred from the ordinary, vivifying to the extraordinary from the world, so that those men then will be able to be included, to be absorbed in the alignment of sacred, not things, not objects so much as things, but objects as events. And so, because they are of events rather than things, alignments always have a rhythmic pace to them. And the index of the rhythmic pace is the dance. And so when one is sacred, one moves in the rhythm of the dance. Every ceremony of ritual comportment has its pace. And it's not just for the sweat lodge for the men of the Plains Indians Sundance. It's a universal truth. A major league pitcher who gets into his game is unbeatable. There was a time a couple of years back when the Boston Red Sox great pitcher Roger Clemens struck out 20 men in one game. There are only 9 innings. 3 times 9 is 27. There were only 7 men who didn't strike out in the whole game. It's an example of someone getting into their game, getting into a pace that is unbreakable, unbeatable. Well, there are ritual masters in antiquity who would have struck out all 27 with just 27 pitches. There are records of ritual masters who were able to do this. When ritual is done right, there's a rhythm to it, there's a pace, so that the absorption is complete. And if one is vivified, if one is ready, to be included like that is to experience the resonance of alignment with everything else that's brought into that alignment. Black Elk talks about how the sweat lodge, and the sweat lodge always traditionally for the Plains Indians made of willows, the 100 willow sweat lodge. And the foundation of the sweat lodge was always to have 4 corners. These 4 corners allowed for a weaving of the willows. And by early June, on the plains of North America, the sapling willows that will have grown very fast, while they're still green, are quite pliable, and you can actually weave them. And so that the sweat lodge is woven then of these 4 corners. And while it has 4 corners, it also has this kind of domed quality. So that if one looks with architectural, artistic vision at a sweat lodge, one recognizes this kind of domed circle on a square basis that occurs only one place in civilized architecture. In all the civilizations of the world, only one place had an architecture based on that kind of squared with a circled, squared architecture. And that place is the great cathedral in Florence, Italy, the Duomo. And it was a famous problem in the Renaissance, how to dome Giotto's square base of the cathedral. And it took a Brunelleschi, aided by his pal Donatello, to find a way in which to put a circular structure so that there could be a dome on a square base. It's a great exercise in the ability to allow oneself to be absorbed into spiritual alignment deep enough to get the intuition, visionarily, of how to do this. And of course, Brunelleschi and Donatello were young giants who prepared themselves because they went from their native Florence down to Rome, and while they were there for about a year, they measured everything in the city, everything in sight, down to the smallest dimension. And in measuring everything in Rome, they came to understand proportion, that proportion includes relationality, and that circles and squares have a relationality which is masterable, finally. Well, the Plains Indians of North America mastered the dome over the square without the benefit of having to go to Rome and measure everything, or to be Brunelleschi's or Donatello's. So these are not primitive people. They're primordial people. And Black Elk talks from the standpoint of being one of the great ritual masters. The photograph that we see in Black Elk Speaks and the Sacred Pipe of the tired old black elk, don't be fooled by this. I'll bring a photograph that was made of black elk in 1945 next week. It's an original photograph, a sepia tone photograph that my friend Manly Hall took in Denver, Colorado of black elk in 1945, and you'll be able to see next week just who he really was. This photograph is of an old Indian, whereas the Manly Hall photograph was a photograph of the spiritually vivified, aligned ritual chief. In the medicine, the health-giving wholeness, in the medicine of the sweat lodge, the purification, the awakening to sacredness, the circle in the center of the square is cut out to contain the fire for the sweat lodge. And that earth, everything must be accounted for in a ritual. Nothing must be left out. There must be an exact completeness all the time, so that a ritual master has a hawk eye towards detail. Makes a neurotic housewife look like slovenliness. If it's not right, then it has to be done over, but one cannot correct it without having gone through the entire sequence. So that one has to wait till next year in order to do this. Now, this is very peculiar. Gladys Reichard found this out when she was participating in ceremonies with the Navajos in the 1920s and 1930s. And she writes that since the chant is a long, complicated charm, the chant is tantamount to being a charm. Since the chant is a long, complicated charm whose usefulness depends upon the mastery of thousands of small details, a chanter must think and remember clearly. For example, a single prayer, which might take an hour to repeat, must be recited and learned as a whole. It is thought to be dangerous to repeat a single word of it or to make a correction until the whole has been repeated. Now, this is extremely important. It's not a throwaway. The entirety of a chant, once it's been vivified and made sacred, must be treated as a whole. You cannot treat the words in the chant as separate items anymore. The chant is the whole. And if one is going to do it, make a correction. If there was an error, one has to complete that chant or go back and start from the beginning again. And only by running through it completely, unblemished, will it be a whole. Will it have its sacredness in the sense that it will be alignable with other elements that have been brought in as wholes. So that if one is thinking in terms of things, this is a profane way of looking at nature. a profane way at looking at objectivity. Instead of things, they are events, and the event is its wholeness. Think how difficult it is not only to have a chant that is able to be run through completely perfectly, but a human being who is completely open so that they can be aligned. Without a human being totally open so that they can be aligned and thus absorbed by the energy flow of the ritual, it ruins the entire ceremony. Which is one reason why outsiders are never allowed in sacred ceremonies that are necessary for life. Not because of some kind of tribal prejudice. It's not on level of prejudice. It's on level of understanding it's going to ruin everything. It's not going to work. Every single object is an event, and the alignment of those events produces the energy flow. And only when the alignments are all vivified and alive, only when it's plugged into the divine, and the applicable tool is here, will the electric current go through? Will the magnetic alignment be efficacious? And only then, if you need to make rain, can you make rain. Only then, if you need to have children born because of some natural decimation and there's no fertility, that fertility can be brought back. That rain can be brought there. Those crops can be brought. The peace that's necessary can be made. The victory in conflict can be had. Not by compelling divinity to obey because one has done this ritual in this way. That's a kind of a black magic. That's a regression. And instead of having a natural referent, it has a vision referent. It has a magic referent. And ritual that has a magic referent is turned inside out. Symbols need to have the ability to release vision. Symbols are related to magic. And symbols make magic possible. But magic is a transcendence. It isn't natural. It doesn't fit in with the natural ecology. It's not on the table. It seemingly is on the table, if you remember the beginning of the lecture. Remember, right at the very beginning, when we talked about what is, we talked about primordiality. We got really down to it and just spoke blunt truth. Like the sweat lodge, whose opening is always east. It's on that eastern path that the earth that's taken from the center of the sweat lodge must be paced out and placed on that path. And just beyond it on that path is where the fire is made to heat the stones. And the fire has to be made with the four directions handled by crossed sticks, and then the vertical of the teepee placed there, and then the stones placed around, making another kind of a teepee of stones. And that who sits on that earth mound and tends that fire, tends those stones, tends the water, tends the sweet grass and brings it in, is never a man, is always a woman. That while the men are purifying in a sweat lodge and no woman can come into that sweat lodge, it's not a sexist thing. It's not because it's only card-carrying males that can join that club. It's because the male is being purified qua male, not qua human. But the guarantor of that is always a woman, a sacred woman. She's the one that tends, sitting on the mound that is at the center of the sweat lodge. She tends the sacred fire. She tends the stones, the water, the sweet grass. She brings them to the sweat lodge. No man can bring them to the sweat lodge. It would be a contamination. It would be a profanation. And so gender-free ritual is a stupidity. It's a quality that's there that we talked about at the very beginning with what is. On the table of nature, on the horizontal plane of nature, our education places nature as a beginning. And if you orient that to the east, moving in a clockwise fashion, it means that ritual, which follows nature, is then east, moving clockwise, is to the south. Ritual occupies a south direction. And myth that follows ritual always occupies then the west. And symbol that follows myth occupies the north. So that on the horizontal plane of orientation in deep wisdom, one moves in an integration ecology of east, south, west, north. And that integration ecology of those four is intersected by a vertical ecology. And the vertical ecology is vision, art, history, and science. But the vertical ecology moves in such a way that its beginning with vision, which in ancient times used to be called magic, or you can call it consciousness if you want, begins at the very same place that nature begins. And that as vision begins there, its first movement is below. And so art occupies the underpart. And history is coming back to the horizon again. And science is at the zenith. So that a cosmology is always at the zenith. But the beginning of that vertical ecology is ostensibly at the same place as the beginning of the natural ecology. And so without knowing the fullness of a sacred education, it is easy to mistake magic for nature and not to know it. And when you mistake magic for nature and think it works the same way, by using a magic referent for ritual, one ends up doing a devolution that falls into the flaw. It falls into the crack that's there. Courtesy of the way things are when they are. It is very difficult to follow. The highfalutin mathematics of it took almost to the 20th century to be able to understand. Plato never fully understood it. Pythagoras understood it well enough to leave it alone and to point out, don't go into this area with any kind of need for certainty. And so ancient exact traditions of wisdom always reserved as a mystery which is there and not specified. Whereas the wisdom of the new aeon, of the new millennium, is a wisdom which is able to keep the mystery by exact specification. You want to know why we don't go into exactness? Here's exactly why we don't go into exactness. Can lay it out. In ritual comportment, vivifying everything to the sacred has this peculiar quality where one has to not mistake groups of things, aggregates of things as things in themselves. There are different orders, and confusing the orders is the popular saying in collegiate philosophy by professors who really didn't understand intellectually the whole issue, so they popularized it and they said you can't mix apples with oranges. That's a kind of a flip, cute way of talking about it. You can't mix apples with oranges. Why can't you mix apples with oranges? And what are apples and oranges in this kind of analogy? We're going to talk more about it in weeks to come and in months to come. And we won't let the issue go away. But one of the fundamental realizations that Bertrand Russell came to in the Principles of Mathematics, which was the seed of the Principia Mathematica of about 10 years later, it reads like this if you write it down. Russell asked whether the class of all classes of things, you take things and you make a class of them, then you make a class of that class, all the classes that there are. Russell asked whether the class of all such classes was a member of itself. And he demonstrated that it was a member of itself logically if and only if it was not. Which is a blunt contradiction. That's why he called it the contradiction. And in discovering why this was so, Principia Mathematica found that the way in which mathematics works vis-a-vis logic is that mathematics is a natural way of looking at this, and mathematics is a conscious differential way of looking at this. That, in a way, the logic process and the mathematical process are such that logic is natural-based while mathematics is consciousness-based. Mathematics is a differential realm, and logic is a natural realm. And that they intersect and they come together at two particular points, at myth and history and at nature and vision, or nature and magic. So that one or the other are always points at which human beings become confused, not out of ignorance, but out of half learning. A little learning is a dangerous thing, is the way in which Benjamin Franklin put it down in Poor Richard's Almanac. A little learning is a dangerous thing. Getting educated halfway is the worst there is. It's like a flawed ritual. If you don't learn the wholeness, then you mistake the partiality for the whole. And part of the esoteric wonderment of all of this is that in nature, the part of anything always can stand for the whole. Why in nature can that be? Because nature is a oneness, a universe of wholeness. It's a single matrix of wholeness. And in a single matrix of wholeness, any part can stand for the whole. But ritual comportment precipitates out of the ambience of the universe the specific existence. And if one mistakes specific existence as a thing instead of as an event, one loses the taste for the process quality which objects have. Objects always have a process taste when they're sacred. And one way to know that they're profaned is that they do not taste alive. We live in a time where ignorance is so universal that people hear with surprise that you can taste whether something is alive or dead. You can do it with food, I'm sure. It's true about any particular objectivity. We're going to talk more next week about this particular angle, this particular development of how primordial men and women understood that ritual needs to be attended to in such a way that the attention itself is alive. And we're going to use two new textbooks, two new books, or not textbooks. I hate the word text. It's since deconstructionist philosophy, the word text has become a real swamp of thingness. But we're using characteristically all the way through our education pairs of books so that we don't get lost in any book. One of the great doctrinaire ways in which the flaw becomes codified in the Western psyche is to become people of the book. The Torah, the Bible, the Quran, in their own ways, in their traditional comportment, are excellent. But in the transcendent gestalts that are made in large civilizations, without them being transformed and carried over into vivified sacrality, they devolve. Not because anyone intends it or even knew it, but they devolve almost automatically because of the flawed way in which the Western psyche comports to things. It's called reduction. And one is familiar that one can reduce the Bible to something very dangerous. One can reduce the Torah to something very dangerous. One can reduce the Quran to something very dangerous. As events of tradition, they are excellent and usable forever. But in the realm of consciousness, they need to be vivified into a transcendence and understood in differential conscious ways rather than as integrated gestalts in a natural way. You can't use the Bible without being able to read the entirety of the Bible. If you could read the entirety of the Bible, it would then be a differentially conscious object, quite useful. But if it's just the Bible, you can see that that becomes a cudgel of coercion rather than a codex of realization. And just this way, one needs to pay attention to many, many different stages. Right now, we're going to next week use two new codexes, a pair of codexes. We're always pairing. Lao Tzu says in the Tao Te Ching that when you're speaking of what is, pairing is the deepest of all. The next pair will be a Greek tragedy and a Buddhist sutra. Both of them present the necessity and techniques of keeping the necessity of paying attention to what you're paying attention to. That's not double talk. It's akin to the old Sufi saying of be prepared to be prepared. Because in a very fast reality, where the mind is like quicksilver and the glints of existence faster still, one has to be prepared to be prepared. And the preparation of being prepared in the sutra is the Satipatthana Sutra, the mindfulness sutra of the historical Buddha. The Greek tragedy is the Bacchae by Euripides. The Bacchae by Euripides is by the old Euripides at the very end of his life. He was about 70 some years old. He was banished from Athens for being a very bad boy. What was bad about him? He was too conscious to be held by the tradition-bound powers of the city fathers, because he had poked his mental finger through the myth that the Greeks were conscious, particularly in respect to women. And so the Bacchae is the exiled old Euripides writing the last Greek tragedy. There were no more Greek tragedies after this. As Faulkner once said, when Shakespeare finished The Tempest, he must have broke his pencil. Euripides broke the pencil of writing Greek tragedy with the Bacchae, because in the Bacchae is the most startling, tragic realization of all, the absolute insanity of the so-called perfectness of masculine Greek civilization, and how it was a tomb for life rather than any kind of sacred matrix. And with that, Greek tragedy died instantly. Oh yes, there were imitators for a couple generations. None of it was saved because none of it was readable. So the Bacchae by Euripides and the Satipatthana Sutra by the historical Buddha, the Mindfulness Sutra, I bring them together because the vivification of ourselves in a profane world sometimes devolves upon us being able to reach inside of ourselves and turn ourselves inside out. And so ritual comportment in the wisdom tradition always recognizes at its deepest apex the need that there may be someone for whom there is no tribe any longer. There is no group any longer. And one is unsure and doubtful of oneself on every level, what to do. And you'll have to come back next week to find out. Thank you.